The night had a stillness that did not belong to Fort Liberty. It was September 14th, 2025, 21:37. The lights along the perimeter fence pulsed like a warning heartbeat flashing across the damp grass. I remember the way the cold bit through my uniform as I stepped out the back door. I was not ready for what I saw. Emma, my 6-year-old. Her small body was crumpled near the fence line as if the world had simply let her fall. Her fingers were clenched, her cheek pressed into the dirt, her hair tangled with leaves. I dropped to my knees before I realized I was moving. The world around me narrowed to the sound of her shallow breathing. My training should have made me steady, but my heartbeat pounded through my ears like gunfire. I turned her gently, my hands steady, but my lungs burning. Her skin was cold, her lips pale. Her wrist bore marks that should never have been there. She opened her mouth and with a trembling breath whispered a name. "Step, Grandma." It was barely audible, but it was enough to detonate something inside me. That single name shattered the thin layer between fear and fury. She had trusted that woman. I had let that woman into our home. I forced my breathing into rhythm. Training, procedure, call emergency, report to military police. I gave coordinates, voice flat, body tense. Paramedics burst through the gate minutes later, boots crunching gravel, flashlights cutting through the dark. They lifted her onto the stretcher and her tiny hand slid from mine. I followed the ambulance in my truck siren, slicing the night open. The dashboard lights painted my face in red and blue. The entire way I could still hear her whisper, "Step, Grandma." It looped in my head like a gunshot you cannot unhear. At Womack Army Medical Center, they wheeled her through the double doors. I did not follow. I stood outside, my boots planted on the concrete, hands gripping the railing until my knuckles burned. I have faced men who wanted to end my life. I have walked through smoke and chaos. None of it felt like this. This was betrayal inside my bloodline. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't shout. It whispers through the voice of a child fighting to breathe. I watched the red ambulance lights reflecting against the metal of my name tag. Captain Rowan Pierce. A title that had kept me steady through combat now felt like armor pressed against an open wound. I thought of the woman who had sat across my kitchen table a week ago, smiling as she offered Emma a piece of pie. Vivian Pierce. Step Grandma. The same woman my daughter had just whispered about as her world faded. The same woman who once told me bloodlines must be protected. I clenched my jaw until it hurt. This was no misunderstanding, no family conflict that could be swept under a polite silence. This was war, only quieter. I straightened my back as the ambulance lights dimmed. In the distance, the military police were already at the scene, taking statements, collecting prints, searching for tracks along the fence. The night smelled like rain and cold soil. I inhaled deeply and let the air burn through my chest. Inside, my daughter was fighting. Outside, I was already preparing. I knew how to build a campaign. This time, the enemy had a familiar face. This time, I was not fighting for a flag. I was fighting for my child. If her last whisper had named Vivian Pierce, then I would make sure that name echoed in every courtroom, every file, every headline, until justice swallowed it whole. What would you do if your child whispered the name of someone you trusted? The first cracks did not appear with loud noises. They came quietly, like hairline fractures beneath polished glass, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. It started with Emma's silence. My daughter had always been a storm of laughter, the kind of child who filled every corner of the house with life. But the moment Vivian's silver sedan turned onto our street, her body stiffened. Her shoulders rose just enough for me to notice, like a small animal sensing something it could not fight. She would stand in the living room holding her favorite stuffed bear, not saying a word, just watching through the blinds. At first, I told myself it was just discomfort. Vivian had always had a way of making people feel small, even adults. But Emma's fear wasn't vague unease. It was sharp, measured, real. I started keeping track of when that silver car appeared. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Sunday afternoons. Times when she knew I was either on base or finishing training runs. Twice my neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, a retired military spouse who never missed a thing, called to say she had seen Vivian's car idling near the fence for more than an hour. She said the woman didn't get out, just sat there, watching. I thanked her, but the truth was it settled in my chest like a stone. Then came the toys. Emma's little wooden box in her room had always been organized in a way only a child could understand. The blue soldiers on the left, the plastic ponies on the right, her father's dog tags wrapped in a red ribbon tucked in the back corner. One night, after I came home from a late shift, I went into her room to check on her. She was asleep, but the toy box was open. The ponies were gone. The ribbon was on the floor. It was subtle, but I knew Emma. She never left it like that. I felt a chill slide down my spine as I knelt by the box. Someone had been in this room. Someone who thought they owned the space. The next morning, Vivian showed up at my front gate like she owned it. Her hair was pulled into a tight chignon, her pearl earrings glinting in the sunlight. She had always carried herself like the world bent slightly for her. She didn't even knock. She pressed the bell once and waited with that stiff smile. I stepped outside, careful calm, my hands behind my back. Emma was at school. That was intentional. Vivian's voice was sweet at first, the way venom hides in honey. Rowan. I think we both know this arrangement isn't right. Emma should be raised at the Pierce estate where she belongs. She needs structure. Legacy. Not some small house at the edge of base housing. I kept my tone even. She has structure. She has me. She doesn't need anything from that house. Vivian's smile thinned. That house is her birthright. And so is my guidance. She's a Pierce child. You're just borrowing her time. There it was. That sliver of ownership that had always been there but never spoken out loud. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. She is my daughter. She's the heir to my late husband's name, Vivian said, tilting her head as if I were a foolish subordinate. You can play Soldier Rowan, but one day you'll understand what bloodline means. I'm only trying to do what's best for her. The front yard held the weight of the argument like the air before a storm. The hum of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant echo of training rounds from the range across the base. It felt too calm for words that dangerous. I told her to leave. She stayed long enough to whisper, "This isn't over," before turning on her heel and walking away, her shoes clicking against the pavement like the ticking of a countdown clock. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after Emma had gone to bed. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I thought back to the funeral, my husband's coffin draped in the flag, the line of uniforms, the way Vivian had stood behind me that day with a hand on my shoulder that felt more like a claim than comfort. I remembered her voice in my ear, soft but sharp. You'll never keep her forever, Rowan. The Pierces protect their own. I had buried that memory under layers of discipline and silence the way soldiers bury their fear before missions. But cracks don't disappear. They widen. I started to notice other things. Emma had begun biting her nails again, something she hadn't done since kindergarten. She flinched at the sound of a car door slamming. One afternoon when I picked her up from school, she refused to get in the truck until I locked the doors twice. When I asked gently what was wrong, she didn't answer. She just whispered, "I don't like when Grandma looks at me like that." Like what sweetheart, I asked, keeping my voice light, like I'm hers. That answer sat in my chest like a burning coal. Vivian had always been possessive, but this was different. It wasn't just entitlement anymore. It was escalation. I adjusted the security cameras around the house. I asked my team on base to make sure no one accessed my schedule without authorization. I began sleeping with my boots by the door again, something I hadn't done since deployment. These weren't habits of paranoia. These were habits of someone who had seen what happens when threats come from familiar faces. I told myself I could still control it. I told myself the situation could be managed quietly, but a soldier always knows when a storm is coming. You feel it in the air before it hits. The silence stretches longer than it should. The faces around you turn just a little too still. That was what it felt like every time Vivian's name appeared on my caller ID, or her car parked down the street. One Sunday afternoon, I found Emma sitting on the porch steps holding the red ribbon. She was quiet, looking at the fence like it was something alive. When I asked her what she was thinking about, she said, "I think Grandma wants me to live with her." I knelt beside her and said, "No one can take you away from me." She looked at me with those wide, serious eyes children get when they know more than they should. She said she can. The crack wasn't just in my house anymore. It was inside my daughter. I put my arms around her and held her longer than usual, feeling the steady beat of her small heart against my chest. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was the last breath before everything fractured. You can sense when a line has been crossed, even if the words haven't been spoken, and that line had just snapped. The night of the incident began like any other training night. I was on the field, my boots sinking into the damp Carolina soil, the floodlights across the range throwing long silver streaks over the sand pits. It was 20:45 when I got the text from the babysitter, just a quick check-in saying Emma was already in her pajamas and watching her favorite cartoon. I remember that because for 1 second I felt the kind of fragile peace military families rarely get. I finished my last set of drills, checked my radio, and headed home with the faint hum of crickets filling the dark stretch of road between the base and the housing line. I parked in front of the house at 2140 and the front door was already open. The babysitter's voice was shaking before I even stepped through the doorway. She's gone. I can't find her. I looked everywhere. Every muscle in my body turned into a blade. I ran past her past the living room straight to the back door. The security light above the porch was flickering like a heartbeat. The night felt too still. My eyes scanned the yard in a sweep. At first, I didn't see her. And then I did. Near the fence line, half hidden behind the shadow of the tree, a small figure lay crumpled in the dirt. I shouted her name, but the sound barely made it through my throat. I sprinted. The grass under my boots blurred. When I dropped to my knees beside her, the earth was cold and slick with dew. Emma's hair was matted with mud, her pajamas stained her wrist, marked with angry red bruises. Her chest rose in shallow, ragged breaths. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. It was worse than screaming. It was silence. I lifted her head gently, pressing 2 fingers to her pulse point, counting the fragile beats against my skin. They were there, but faint. Too faint. I shouted to the babysitter to call emergency, but my hand was already on my radio. My voice was steady even as my heart was tearing open. This is Captain Pierce. I need immediate medical response and military police at 1148 Maple Street. Possible assault. 6-year-old unconscious. The response was immediate. Sirens in the distance. The flashing red strobes of the ambulance bled through the trees as they pulled up. 2 MP vehicles rolled in behind them. They secured the perimeter voices, sharp boots on gravel, the sound of protocol kicking into motion. The paramedics lifted Emma onto the stretcher, and I caught a glimpse of her small hand hanging limp, smeared with mud. I climbed into my truck and followed them, the convoy's flashing lights burning into my rearview mirror like a brand I would never forget. At Womack Army Medical Center, everything moved fast, but it felt unbearably slow. Nurses swarmed the entrance. A doctor called out instructions. Someone asked me questions about time location who was home. I answered mechanically. 20 minutes missing. Backyard. Found near the fence. No signs of forced entry. Military police spoke into their radios. CID officers arrived before Emma was even out of the trauma bay. Their faces were composed the way investigators always are when they step into something ugly. I watched from the hallway as they put up yellow tape around my yard on the feed of my phone's security app. My home, my sanctuary, now a crime scene. The ICU door was a blur of movement for the next 2 hours. IVs, oxygen, monitors beeping in uneven rhythms. I paced the waiting room without realizing it, my boots leaving a trail of dirt across the tiles. I replayed every second in my head. The open door, the flickering light, the fence, the bruises on her wrists. I'd seen injuries like that in combat zones, but never on a child's skin. Never on hers. When they finally let me in, the room was sterile white and too quiet. Emma's face looked impossibly small against the pillow, her eyelashes damp, her lips pale. Machines hissed softly beside her. I sat on the edge of the chair, leaning forward. I didn't want to touch her until the nurse nodded. Her eyelids fluttered once, twice, and then she opened them just enough to see me. Her breathing hitched and a tear slid down the corner of her eye. She whispered, her voice paper thin. "Step, Grandma." She was here. For a second, the entire world went still. The sound of the machines faded. The hum of the hallway disappeared. It was just that sentence hanging in the air like a gunshot that no one else heard but me. My hand tightened around the edge of the chair so hard it hurt. I leaned closer, brushing the hair from her forehead, and forced my voice not to shake. "You're safe, baby. I'm here." But inside, I wasn't calm. I wasn't steady. Inside, a fuse was burning slow and hot. I stepped out of the ICU, letting the door close softly behind me. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and metal. CID officers were still outside, talking to the MP commander. They were already asking for access to my security footage in the base entry logs. One of them looked at me carefully, aware of the rank pinned to my chest. "Captain Pierce," he said, "we'll find out who did this." But I already knew. I had known from the second she whispered the name. I walked to the parking lot in silence, the night colder than before. My truck was parked under the harsh white hospital lights. I sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. Instead, I pulled my name tag off my uniform and turned it over in my hand. Captain Rowan Pierce. That rank had kept me alive through deployments, through missions, through death. But tonight, it was a weapon, and I intended to use it. I closed my fist around the metal until its edges bit into my palm. My reflection in the windshield wasn't a grieving mother. It was something harder, sharper. My eyes had turned into the steel that comes after loss, after betrayal. I stared at the hospital entrance, at the thin line of light under the ICU doors. Vivian Pierce had crossed a line she could never return from, and I would make sure she learned what happens when you aim at a soldier's child. The initial investigation moved with a polite efficiency that masked a surprising lack of urgency, and that was the first thing that set my teeth on edge. Military police secured the scene, took photos, logged times, and CID came through with the practiced faces of people who have seen worse and think they have seen it all. They asked the right procedural questions, collected samples that would later be cataloged and boxed, and assured me they would follow every lead. But there was an undercurrent to the way the questions were asked, and the file numbers were assigned, like someone had set a soft limit on how deep they intended to go. Within hours, it was clear why. Vivian Pierce was not just a widow with a taste for pearls and a house on the hill. She was family to a constellation of power in this county. Her name opened doors cut through red tape, and I began to realize bought quiet nods from people who could have made this an immediate federal priority. I saw it in a call the CID lead took at the edge of the yard. The low tones of deference that did not match the seriousness of what had happened to a 6-year-old on military property. I saw it again the following morning when a liaison from the county council called the base commander to offer assistance, and the conversation ended with a promise to handle things internally. It was as if someone had stepped between the truth and the public and placed a hand there, smoothing the ripples out so the surface could look calm. That was the moment I understood the investigation was at risk of being made harmless. I was not naive enough to think everyone could be bought, but I had learned enough about power to know when it resented exposure. If the system was going to fold into itself to protect a name, then I could not rely on it to protect my child. My instinct as a soldier put me into motion. I began collecting what the official investigators might not feel free to collect because those pieces of truth could not be coerced into silence. I started with what was immediately available, the security footage from our house cameras and neighboring properties. My camera showed the backyard in wide angle, a grainy view, but clear on the timeline. The babysitter's check-in text had a timestamp. Emma's disappearance was a clean gap of 20 minutes. On my monitor, the edge of a vehicle's tire light passed into frame at 21:22, just before the window when Emma went missing and when the babysitter first noticed her absence. The footage was not high definition, but it was enough to establish motion. I copied the files to a secure drive, labeled them, and made multiple encrypted backups. I printed frames and taped them to the inside of my closet door, a soldier's map of evidence, because obsession organizes itself into a plan. I knocked on doors in the morning because neighbors see what investigators sometimes choose not to ask. Mrs. Anderson told me about the silver sedan idling near the fence before, but Mrs. Patel on the corner offered something else. She had a Ring camera at her driveway and had saved footage for a week. Her clip showed a dark SUV pulling into the cul-de-sac at 21:15 and then leaving at 21:45. The license plate was blurred in the video, but the make and model and the unique scuff on the rear bumper were visible. I wrote down the description and breathed for the first time in days. It matched the sort of vehicle Vivian drove. I called Ethan Morales while standing in Mrs. Patel's kitchen, my voice a low thread. Ethan and I had served together on a deployment where he ran counter-surveillance and technical ops that kept us breathing through more than one hot night. He now worked as a civilian investigator on base cases and had a reputation for pulling images out of static. I told him exactly what I'd seen and asked for help, not asking permission, because grief does not come with a pause button. Within hours, Ethan arrived tired-eyed and smiling with that grim relief of someone who appreciates a problem that uses his skills. He looked at the footage with a scientist's patience, and then, when he found the frame with the SUV, he ran it through enhancement software he had pulled from an evidence locker where forgotten tools slept. He adjusted exposure, isolated the audio, and combed the metadata. He cross-referenced base entry logs and vehicle registration lists with a tenacity that made my chest hurt with gratitude. The results were quiet and devastating. The SUV was registered to a trust belonging to Vivian Pierce. The time it was at the cul-de-sac matched the 20-minute gap. The tire scuff matched a series of tracks in the soft mud at the back fence. Someone had been at my yard for the time Emma disappeared. When I took the file to CID and showed them the enhancement, I watched the change in their faces. It was a small victory, but it did not change the broader pattern. By midday, a cherry on top of a rotten cake appeared, the county council representative dropped by base, and within hours, the senior CID investigator was told to reassess priorities pending consultation. It was the euphemism of people who want trouble to go away politely. I felt my stomach drop, but Ethan put a hand on my shoulder and reminded me of something he had said in the field when everything was collapsing around us: never give the enemy ground to stand on. So we kept digging. We interviewed the babysitter again and again, gently, to keep her recollection fresh. She had gone outside to check on the trash can, and the gate had been closed when she returned. She had not heard a scuffle. She did, however, remember a scent that made her throat close when she described it a floral perfume that did not match the air of the base. It was the same perfume Vivian wore the afternoon she had come to discuss Emma's future. It was a small detail, but those are the ones that build a case. I walked the perimeter at dawn with MP and noted tire patterns. The mud held impressions that matched the tread pattern Ethan identified in the footage. We brought in a forensics tech who dusted for prints at the fence and found partial smudges that would later be compared to a database. Meanwhile, I secured texts and emails. Vivian had been messaging the family attorney, a man with a smooth voice and a legal practice that catered to old money. The messages were civil on their face, but the frequency rose sharply in the week leading up to the night Emma was taken. There were references to arrangements, timing, and one line I could not ignore: "I will handle the matter quietly." I photographed the threads and filed copies with Ethan. The more we found, the more it became apparent that Vivian had been moving pieces like a chess player for weeks, perhaps months. This was not a momentary act of cruelty. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was rehearsed. That realization changed the way I breathed. It turned a family tragedy into a strategic problem with a map and players. I stopped hoping the system would simply do its job and made the decision to create an alternate path to the truth. I enlisted help discreetly. A JAG lawyer I trusted, Lieutenant Rebecca Cole, agreed to consult privately off the record, advising on what evidence would be admissible and how to secure chain of custody without alerting the wrong people. Ethan pulled a list of Vivian's financial movements and found one oddity: a series of cash withdrawals from a private account around the same time other families on the estate reported trouble with contractors and disappearances of small parcels of land. It began to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern of leverage and intimidation. When I presented this to the MP commander and suggested we expand the scope beyond an assault suggesting possible financial motives and intimidation, his eyes darted to a file on his desk and he nodded slowly. He had been told by someone above to be considerate in how we handled the Pierce name. That phrase now meant the chain of custody for the truth was at risk of being cut. Each piece of evidence we found was a vein of light in a body of darkness. It required patience, careful handling, and a willingness to push against institutions that had been gentle with power and sharp with those without it. I learned how to keep my voice even while my hands trembled. I scheduled a meeting with Ethan and Rebecca in a small diner off base, the kind of place where you can have a private conversation in plain sight. We planned our next moves with the military precision of people who understood stakes. Ethan would query traffic cams on the county roads for matches to the SUV, pull cell tower pings for the area, and coordinate with a friend in forensics who owed him a favor. Rebecca would draft a legal pressure point, a formal request that could compel the base to hold on to evidence, while she petitioned for federal oversight if the local system refused to cooperate. I would do what I had always done best: be the steady face and the stubborn force that will not let this lie rest. When I left that diner, I felt the shape of the campaign in my pocket like a live wire. This was no longer a domestic dispute that might be solved with soft words and a family meeting. This was an orchestrated move by someone confident enough to assume the system would protect them. I understood then that we were not only up against a woman with money, we were up against a network that believed itself untouchable. I also understood that networks have weak points. They are composed of people, and people make mistakes. Our job was to find those mistakes and make them speak. I stopped pretending the system would save us, and I started acting like a commander preparing an operation. The first rule I wrote for myself was simple and brutal: control the narrative by controlling the evidence. I knew CID would do their job at the surface, but I also knew the surface could be polished if someone with influence wanted it to shine. So I set up a parallel process that ran the way I had run patrols in a deployed compound, with clear objectives, phases, and redundancy. Phase 1 was consolidation. Ethan and Rebecca and I met in that same diner before dawn, and we made a list. Secure original footage from every possible camera in the neighborhood. Get the babysitter to write and sign a sworn statement while her memory was still raw. Pull any entry and exit logs for the base gate on the night of the incident. Preserve the mud sample and tire impressions. Every item on that list had to be copied, backed up, and placed where chain of custody could be documented. Ethan immediately went to work with his kit. He had a quiet way of moving through computers and hard drives that felt like a prayer to evidence. He pulled raw files from the Ring and Nest systems of 3 neighbors and exported them in their original formats. He pulled base vehicle logs and cross-referenced timestamps with cell ping data he had access to through an old contact who still worked in traffic analysis. Rebecca set up a process to file informal discovery requests through channels that would not tip off the county liaison. She taught me how to phrase requests so they would appear routine but would compel retention of materials. It was legal choreography, and it bought us time. While Ethan and Rebecca secured the technical and legal framework, I tightened the perimeter of our household. I installed additional cameras in obvious and unobvious places. I changed routines to avoid presenting patterns the way a unit changes patrol routes in hostile territory. I asked a trusted friend on base to sit in an unmarked vehicle 2 streets over for a few nights, not to confront anyone but to have an outsider witness if anything unusual happened. People questioned the theater at first, but I had found that taking physical steps to protect a child quiets a mother in a way words cannot. Next, we dug into financials. Rebecca, with her JAG badge and her knowledge of lawful pressure points, directed a series of subpoenas and protective orders that would be ready to file if the local system began to stonewall. We could not yet make those filings public because that would risk alerting the Pierce machine. Instead, we prepared the paperwork and the affidavits, and we held them in reserve like a reserve force. Ethan found bank transfers that were small but suspicious cash withdrawals tied to a trust account payments to contractors who handled property disputes. Each transaction by itself meant little, but when we layered them over the stories from families who had been pressured to sell, a pattern emerged. Vivian had the networks to intimidate and to purchase silence. That network would be our enemy, but networks have joints and seams. They fall apart under procedural pressure. We mapped those seams. The breakthrough came when a neighbor located a camera clip from the cul-de-sac, and Ethan enhanced it until the SUV was identifiable. It was registered to a trust associated with the Pierce estate, and a courier plate was linked to a limousine company that occasionally transported guests for the family. That was the link between Vivian and the evening at our house. It did not prove intent, but it proved presence. Then we found the Watcher. A private contractor in the county had been paid to perform surveillance. Emails revealed small invoices for observational services and time logs that corresponded to the nights before Emma's incident. When I opened that file, my hands were shaking, but my voice was not. The invoices listed a name and an address. We visited the address and found a woman who admitted to being paid to monitor activity. She looked like a ghost of someone trying to justify doing wrong to earn a living. She confirmed she had been employed by someone connected to the Pierce estate to keep an eye on movements around my house. It was not a direct confession of assault, but it established that surveillance had been organized. That was a bridge from presence to intent. With those threads in hand, we began to pull publicly and privately at the edges. Publicly, we maintained the narrative that the base and CID were investigating. Privately, Ethan fed enhanced footage to Rebecca, who used it to draft a preemptive legal petition that would be filed with federal authorities if local officials attempted to obscure the chain of custody. We did not move too soon. In operations, timing is everything. You expose too early and the opponents scatter. You expose too late and the trail goes cold. We chose a window when the county council would be in session and before Vivian could take any steps to relocate assets or influence witnesses. To that end, we began outreach to journalists quietly. Not the sensationalist kind, but the local investigative reporter who had a reputation for following irregularities in land deals and had clashed with the Pierce interests before. We fed him a carefully curated file showing anomalies in property transfers and the obvious connection between payments and the intimidation of small landowners. He asked for time to corroborate. He was cautious, and I respected that. All of this required discipline. It required me to be the patient force, the one who waits for the right moment while others act impulsively. I practiced breathing through the anger and writing down next steps in a notebook the way I would brief a platoon. I rehearsed testimony with Rebecca, who coached me on how to stay credible while recounting what I had seen and heard. We planned for countermeasures. I knew Vivian had people who could make life difficult for a babysitter or a neighbor. We made sure the babysitter had relocation resources and witness protection contacts through the channel Rebecca opened. We ensured the evidence. Every file had duplicates and multiple storage locations. Ethan burned encrypted copies and hid them where only he and I knew. We documented the chain of custody so that if anyone asked where the evidence came from, a paper trail would lead to forensic credibility instead of hearsay. Then we created the bait to draw Vivian into a place where she could not hide. That was phase 2. We orchestrated a meeting framed as a family mediation to discuss Emma's schooling and the possibility of shared custody. The invitation was professional and polite. It referenced duty of care and the best interests of the child. It was signed by a neutral mediator whom we had vetted and arranged to be present. Under the surface, the mediator was briefed to keep the conversation on record and to ensure an environment in which statements would be captured by multiple devices. Ethan would be in the room physically as a quiet presence, and Rebecca would have a legal team standing by to issue subpoenas if Vivian attempted to remove evidence. The meeting was a trap in the cleanest sense of the word, a legal snare dressed in afternoon tea. On the day of the meeting, Vivian arrived with the practiced charm of someone who believed charm could rewrite contracts. She sat tall pearls in place, and for a moment, I almost missed the woman who had once placed a comforting hand on my shoulder at the funeral. But that was vanity. I had no room for it. We spoke calmly about schedules and schools, and Vivian offered a rehearsed line about legacy and family, soft as silk and sharp as thorns. When she spoke, it was with the confidence of someone who believed consequences were a theater she could outplay. The bait worked. She took the thread about timing and arrangements and ran with it. She made a comment that was almost a slip about ensuring things were managed properly before moving Emma. It was not a smoking gun, but it was a loose board in a floor of lies. Meanwhile, Ethan stepped in with a subtle cue. His phone buzzed a prearranged alert that played a clip on the mediator's laptop. The room went quiet as the footage played the SUV sliding into the cul-de-sac at the time of Emma's disappearance. Vivian's expression shifted in the first real crack of composure I had seen. Her face flushed not with anger, but with alarm. That alarm is a compass in an investigation. People who are guilty have a rhythm they cannot control, and that day she betrayed herself. Phase 3 was the legal strike. We already had Rebecca's petition ready. We filed it with federal oversight and submitted evidentiary packets to the appropriate offices, citing the pattern of intimidation, the surveillance invoices, the financial anomalies, and the presence of the SUV at our property. We requested that the case be handled with a joint task force because local officials had conflicts of interest. The papers moved like a lever pulling a block. Once federal attorneys saw the scope of transactions and the risk of obstruction, they initiated a parallel review that limited local interference. Within days, warrants were executed for records, and agents came with authority that could not be politely redirected by a county council whisper. That legal pressure changed the game. The Pierce name did not protect as easily when national scrutiny arrived. It did not shield fortunes from subpoenas. My role in all of this, the thing that kept me steady, was not vengeance in the moment, but the steady accumulation of right moves. Each step was a measured cold action designed to expose a network rather than to inflame it. For anyone watching, it might have looked like patience. For me, it felt like assembling the forces for a decisive strike. If you were in my shoes, if your child had been the one to whisper betrayal, could you do it? Could you hold the line between righteous anger and tactical calm, build a campaign in the quiet hours, and wait for the moment when the evidence would speak louder than money? The trap was built slowly and precisely, the way you build a perimeter you know someone will eventually walk into. We dressed it as a mediation session, something that looked harmless from the outside, the kind of family negotiation rich families love because it makes their crimes look like misunderstandings. The invitation went out in carefully neutral language, citing the best interests of Emma structured around the possibility of shared custody. It was signed by a neutral mediator, a man with clean hands and a reputation for discretion. He didn't know he was standing in a war zone. Vivian accepted without hesitation. That told me everything. People who think they still have control walk straight into rooms where they believe their charm and power will carry them. The session was scheduled at a private office near the courthouse, a place where people came to argue about inheritances and never expected war. Ethan set up our control center 2 rooms over with Rebecca and a small team from CID. The entire meeting would be recorded, streamed in real time to federal legal observers and backed up on encrypted drives. Ethan had hacked into Vivian's car system that morning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was in deep. He had found a hidden dashcam feed buried in the SUV's data logs. It wasn't enough to play yet, but it would be when we needed it. The timing had to be surgical. The day of the meeting was clear and cold, a Carolina morning with pale sun and a wind sharp enough to make the flag outside the building crack against its pole. Vivian arrived at 10:03 a.m. in the same SUV that had idled near my house the night Emma nearly died. She stepped out wearing pearls and navy cashmere like she was attending a garden brunch. She shook the mediator's hand with the poise of someone convinced of her own untouchability. She greeted me with a smile that didn't bother pretending to be warm. I returned it with nothing. In combat, you don't blink first. We entered the room. The air smelled faintly of old wood and legal paper. There was a single round table, 3 chairs, 1 pitcher of water. I sat on one side, Vivian on the other, the mediator between us. She crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap like she was already the victor. The moment the door closed, the red light on Ethan's recording feed blinked to life. CID was watching. Federal attorneys were listening. The mediator began with polite words about cooperation and compromise. Vivian let him speak for 30 seconds before taking over. She had a script and she performed it flawlessly at first. She spoke about family legacy, about how Emma deserved a better future surrounded by wealth and guidance. She carefully positioned herself as a matriarch who had only ever meant well. She used words like structure and tradition, the vocabulary of people who dress control as care. I let her talk. I watched her not blinking, letting every sentence dig her deeper into the illusion of safety. When she paused to take a sip of water, I leaned forward just enough for my voice to cut through the air. "You were there that night, Vivian." Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying," I said, keeping my voice even steady, soldier flat. "Your SUV was seen at the cul-de-sac at 2122. 20 minutes before Emma was found in the dirt. Your car was there." She laughed softly, the way people laugh when they think they're still in control. "I visit that neighborhood often. That doesn't prove anything." That was when Ethan sent the first signal from the control room. The mediator's laptop, which had been sitting idle at the corner of the table, pinged softly and the screen came to life. The camera feed showed a grainy but unmistakable image Vivian's SUV pulling into the cul-de-sac. A timestamp glowed in the lower corner. 22:36. The vehicle sat there for 19 minutes and 40 seconds. When it pulled away, it turned onto Maple Street. Her face tightened just slightly, but enough. I saw the crack appear. She tried to brush it off. Someone must have borrowed the car, she said lightly, but the pitch of her voice climbed just enough for everyone watching to hear it. Your vehicle has biometric locks. Ethan's voice came through the intercom clear and steady. Only your key fob or your fingerprint starts it. Vivian froze. The mediator shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet. This was beyond his script now. I watched her eyes narrow, the sharp calculation behind them sparking. She was realizing this wasn't a negotiation. This was a battlefield, and she was surrounded. The conversation moved from charm to heat. Vivian's words sharpened. She dropped the matriarch tone and leaned forward. Emma is my family, too, she said, voice hard now. Someone has to make sure she grows up the right way. She needs to be taught. She needs to be disciplined properly. She needs to learn where she belongs. That was the moment. Those words. She needs to be taught. Disciplined properly. The softness was gone. The mask had slipped. Rebecca gave a subtle nod to the CID officer listening on the other end. Every word was being transcribed and recorded. I let silence stretch for a heartbeat just long enough for the weight of her statement to settle. What exactly did you mean by disciplined, Vivian? She exhaled through her nose like someone irritated by insolence. Don't twist my words. You've raised that girl to be soft. Someone had to teach her. She stopped herself too late. Her hands clenched on her lap. Ethan pressed the second button. The hacked feed from the SUV's internal camera came online. On the laptop, the image flickered and then cleared. Vivian in the driver's seat on the night of the assault, the reflection of my fence line visible through the windshield. A man's voice on the passenger side asking, "Is she out yet?" Vivian's voice answering, "Almost. Just keep it quiet." The mediator leaned back like someone who had just realized the floor beneath him wasn't solid. Vivian turned pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "You were there," I said, voice low, steady, lethal. "You watched." Her lawyer, who had been silent until that point, finally shifted uncomfortably, whispering to her, but it was too late. CID was already moving in the adjacent room. The recording was secure, backed up in multiple streams. The federal attorneys were on the line. There was no putting this genie back in its bottle. Vivian's composure cracked wide open. She slammed her hand on the table water splashing from the pitcher. "You think this will change anything? Do you know who I am?" she spat. "Yes," I said, leaning in. "I know exactly who you are, and so does everyone else now." The door opened, and CID agents stepped inside, not to arrest her yet, but to formally seize the recording as evidence in an active federal case. The mediator sat frozen, his carefully neutral room now a battlefield scattered with the debris of Vivian's arrogance. Ethan's voice came through the intercom one last time, calm as a man watching a domino line fall. "We've got it all on record." Vivian tried to collect herself, but it was over. Her power had always lived in the shadows, whispers to councilmen, quiet donations, lawyers who made things disappear. But now her words were out in the open, recorded, streamed, unshakable. I watched her breathe in sharp, ragged bursts like someone who just realized she was standing on a collapsing bridge. She stared at me, searching for the woman she used to intimidate. She didn't find her. This was the public exposure moment, the one you can't buy your way out of. For a long second, no one spoke. The mediator looked between us like a man realizing he'd witnessed the unmasking of a queen. Vivian's lawyer mumbled about procedure. The CID officer informed her formally that she was now part of an active investigation under federal oversight. She stood finally, her shoulders stiff, chin lifted as if trying to salvage dignity from rubble. But she couldn't take back what she said. She couldn't erase the footage. She couldn't bury this under old money and long shadows anymore. As she walked out of that room with 2 CID agents trailing her, the building itself seemed to exhale. I sat back in my chair, my fingers pressed to the cool wood of the table, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. Ethan stepped out of the control room with Rebecca beside him. He didn't need to say anything. None of us did. This was the moment we'd been building toward. Vivian Pierce, the untouchable matriarch, had just been dragged into the light, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The arrest came at dawn. I watched it on a live feed Ethan set up from a public camera 2 streets away, my hands steady around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. The Pierce estate, that monument to arrogance wrapped in manicured lawns and stone pillars, was crawling with federal and state law enforcement. Black SUVs lined the curved driveway like a silent procession. CID agents, JAG, council, and county sheriffs moved with methodical precision, their breath visible in the morning air. Vivian Pierce stepped out in a silk robe and pearls, her hair still perfect as if dignity could protect her. The cuffs clicked behind her wrists, small, simple, final. She tried to speak to the lead agent, and when that failed, she turned to the cameras with a brittle smile, the kind rich people wear when they believe the world will eventually right itself around them. But this time, it wouldn't. By noon, every major local outlet had broken the story. Pierce family matriarch arrested on federal and state charges. Her name, once whispered like a power, was now printed on scrolling tickers beneath bold headlines. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. North Carolina in late autumn has a way of making every surface feel sharper, like the wind itself is listening. The gallery was packed with journalists, community members, and a handful of military officers who understood the gravity of what it meant when a powerful civilian targeted the family of an active duty officer. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the weight of their absence was almost heavier than their presence. Every eye felt like a lens. Vivian entered in a gray suit, no pearls this time. Her hair tied back in a severe bun, she carried herself with the defiance of someone still convinced that legacy is a shield. Her lawyers flanked her like armor. The prosecution opened with quiet efficiency, listing the charges. Felony child endangerment, attempted kidnapping, assault on federal property, conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful surveillance. Each word landed like a nail. I sat at the witness table, my uniform immaculate, my spine straight. I had worn it deliberately. This wasn't just personal. It was institutional. They called me first. The clerk swore me in my hand, steady in the air. I took the stand and met Vivian's gaze for the first time since the trap. She didn't look like the woman who used to offer fake comfort at my husband's funeral. She looked like a cornered animal pretending it was still in charge of the forest. The prosecutor began with basic questions, name, rank, relationship to the victim. I answered clearly. Then came the night of September 14th. I described every detail with the clarity of someone who had replayed the moment in their head 1,000 times. The cold ground, the bruises on Emma's wrists, the silence that was worse than screaming. I spoke in short, deliberate sentences, the kind that leave no room for interpretation. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Vivian's lawyer objected twice, trying to frame my testimony as emotionally manipulative. The judge overruled both without blinking. When the prosecutor played the footage Ethan had pulled from her SUV, the room changed. The grainy image of her face, lit by the dashboard light, filled the screen. The man's voice asking, "Is she out yet?" and her answer calm and chilling. Almost. Just keep it quiet. Some people in the gallery gasped softly. One juror pressed a hand to her chest. Vivian didn't flinch, but the color drained from her face. Her lawyer leaned forward to whisper something urgently, but damage like that isn't reversible. The babysitter testified next. Her voice shook at first, but when she recounted the exact timeline of the night, she grew steadier. She talked about the door, about noticing Emma was gone, about the panic that followed. Then Mrs. Anderson from down the street took the stand. She spoke of the silver SUV, the late-night engine idling the woman she saw through the tinted glass. Mrs. Patel followed her footage of the SUV, matching the one from Ethan's archive. Each witness added a stitch to the net being drawn around Vivian. She sat there, her hands clasped on the defense table, lips pressed so tightly they were almost white. When her lawyers presented their case, they pivoted to the oldest trick in the book, They argued diminished responsibility, claiming she had been under significant psychological distress, that the death of her husband years prior had destabilized her judgment. They painted her not as a predator, but as a grieving woman who made a tragic mistake. It was rehearsed, smooth practice. They brought in a psychiatrist who had never treated her to offer a generic evaluation based on family statements. It might have worked in another courtroom against another person, but it wasn't going to work here. When cross-examined, the psychiatrist admitted he had not personally evaluated Vivian, nor had he reviewed the surveillance footage. His testimony withered under the prosecutor's quiet surgical questioning. Then, Rebecca Cole took the stand not as my friend, but as a legal expert on JAG jurisdiction. She explained clearly how the Pierce estate's proximity to federal property gave the federal government clear authority. She outlined the evidence trail. She translated legal precision into language that the jury could understand. Her delivery was calm, lethal in its clarity. The defense made one last attempt to sway the narrative. Vivian herself testified. She spoke in soft tones, her voice trembling just enough to suggest fragility, but never losing its edge. She blamed her fragile state of mind. She said she never meant to hurt Emma, only to protect the family's legacy. The prosecutor let her speak, gave her rope. And then gently but firmly he replayed her own words. She needs to be disciplined properly. Her mask cracked in real time. She tried to explain, but explanations crumble when truth is already echoing in a room. I was called back to the stand for rebuttal. The prosecutor asked only one question. Captain Pierce. Do you believe Vivian Pierce acted by accident that night? I looked at the jury. I thought of Emma's tiny hands covered in mud. I thought of Vivian's car sitting in the dark. I thought of her face when the footage played. No, I said. She acted with intention. She knew exactly what she was doing. The judge's gavel fell once to silence the murmurs. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was read in a quiet that pressed against the walls. Guilty on all counts. Vivian's face went pale, her hands gripping the table like it might save her from sinking. The judge's sentencing was swift. The words, child endangerment, conspiracy, and aggravated assault rang through the chamber like the end of a war drum. 25 years with no eligibility for early release. The estate would be seized under forfeiture provisions tied to the surveillance and conspiracy charges. Her name, once used to bend others, now hung like lead. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like birds, sensing blood. I didn't stop to speak to them. This wasn't a victory to parade. It was justice, and justice isn't a show, it's a reckoning. Ethan and Rebecca stood beside me at the top of the courthouse steps. It was windy. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled like rain. Ethan said quietly, "It's done." I didn't answer. There are no neat endings for things like this. But there was clarity. Vivian Pierce had learned the hard way that money cannot erase fingerprints in mud, and power does not silence evidence recorded in truth. In the following days, the fallout spread fast. Local news dissected the trial. Commentators talked about how unprecedented it was for a family of that stature to face consequences so severe. Families who had once been quiet began to speak. Some of the people she had intimidated for years stepped forward. The ripple effect was real-wide, irreversible. But the most important thing happened in a quiet hospital room 2 miles from base. Emma was sitting on her bed coloring when I walked in. Her cast was off. The bruises on her wrists were fading. She looked up and smiled a small, cautious smile, but it was real. I knelt beside her, pressed my forehead to hers, and for the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe without looking over our shoulders. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't scream or flash like breaking news. It moves like water, slow and steady, carving through stone until it leaves a mark no one can erase. And that mark now stretched across the Pierce estate and every whisper of its former power. The woman who thought she could shape my daughter's future with fear was now just another name in a docket. A case number, a cautionary tale. The message came 2 weeks after the sentencing, buried inside a stack of formal notices forwarded through my attorney. At first glance, it looked like another procedural document, something about asset seizure estate division, the kind of bureaucratic debris that follows the downfall of someone who once believed they were untouchable. But the last page was different. It was handwritten in a slanted script I recognized instantly. Vivian Pierce, the woman who had nearly destroyed everything that mattered to me. She had managed to get a letter out from the correctional facility bypassing the official channels through someone who still owed her favors. She wrote about regret in words that did not sound like her. She called what she did a mistake, a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness. She asked me to help her by filing for a review to speak to someone who could ease the sentence. She said she was old, that prison wasn't for women like her, that she was losing everything. She said her attorneys had warned her the estate was frozen, her name blackened beyond repair, her legacy slipping through her fingers. She ended it with a line that made the paper feel heavier in my hands. You know I loved Emma. I just did what I thought was right. Please, Rowan, don't let me die here. I folded the letter and set it on the table without responding. There was a time when the sound of her voice could unnerve me. That time was over, but it didn't surprise me. People like Vivian don't vanish quietly. They reach back even from the ruins, trying to claw at any remnant of control they can find. It's not love. It's entitlement wearing a new mask. I didn't answer the letter, but a week later, the prison contacted my attorney to inform me she had formally requested a visitation. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, the soldier part, knew this was the final loose thread in a war already won. Leaving it hanging wasn't an option. Closure isn't always silence. Sometimes it's looking the enemy in the eye one last time and making sure they understand the war is over. The visitation room smelled like bleach and something metallic, the way institutions do when they're trying to cover decay with order. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A glass partition divided the room into two halves. On my side, a plain metal chair and table. On hers, the same, except she was flanked by two correctional officers. Vivian entered slowly, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman who used to glide into rooms with pearls and perfume now shuffled forward in a beige prison uniform. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was streaked with gray and pulled back in a loose bun that made her look smaller. Her posture wasn't regal anymore. It was bent tired, like the weight of her own choices had finally settled where it belonged on her. She sat down, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the handset. When she spoke, her voice had none of its old precision. It was thin, cracked at the edges. Rowan. I didn't speak. I lifted the receiver slowly, but I didn't offer comfort in my silence. She exhaled shakily. I know what I did was wrong. A pause, the kind that waits for pity. I thought I was protecting the family. I thought I was protecting Emma. Everything I built, it's gone. They've frozen everything. My name is in the papers every day. I can't sleep in that cell. I can't breathe. I know you can talk to them. I know you can help me. Please. Her please wasn't soft. It wasn't remorse. It was a remnant of power reshaped into desperation. She leaned forward, pressing her hand against the glass like she could somehow bridge the distance. You're a good woman, Rowan. You've always been better than this family. That's why I know you'll help me. I felt the old fury rise cold and steady, not the kind that makes you shake, but the kind that anchors you. I let her talk. I let her pile up excuses and old justifications like sandbags against a storm that had already passed. She spoke about her health, her age, about the way prison wasn't made for people like her. She said her lawyer was working on an appeal, but it would be stronger with my voice behind it. She spoke of legacy as if that word could still command loyalty. She said, "We can fix this." That was when I finally spoke. I leaned forward, my voice calm, quiet enough to make her lean closer to hear it. You almost took everything from me. I won't give you mercy you never gave my daughter. Her breath hitched audibly. The hand she'd pressed against the glass dropped to the table. I didn't stop. You stood by a fence in the dark and watched a child you claimed to love bleed into the dirt. You called it legacy. You called it discipline. You called it family. What you did has a name, Vivian. It's called cruelty. And cruelty doesn't get mercy. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. I had spent too many nights staring at my ceiling, listening to Emma's uneven breathing, memorizing every bruise on her wrists. Tears don't erase fingerprints. They don't undo plans made in silence. They don't resurrect trust that was never real to begin with. Vivian began to sob softly, a sound that felt almost alien coming from her. For years, she'd been a woman carved out of marble, unshakable, unreachable. Now she was just a person old, frightened, and cornered by the consequences she had earned. She whispered something I could barely hear through the phone. I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't flinch. Yes, you did. You just didn't mean to get caught. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Her sobbing slowed. Her eyes searched my face for something softness, forgiveness, weakness. She found none of it. I had already given too much of my life to her shadow. That ended in the courtroom. The guard stepped forward, a silent reminder that her time was up. She panicked, slamming her palm against the glass. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking into the room. "Please, Rowan. I can't die here. Please don't leave me here." I stood slowly, setting the handset down with deliberate care. My hand didn't shake. My heartbeat didn't quicken. I looked at her one last time, not as a woman who once held power over my family, but as what she truly was, now a convict with no more cards to play. "You're exactly where you belong," I said softly. She broke then. Her shoulders shook, and she let out a sound that was neither human nor inhuman, just hollow. The officers stepped in, took her by the arms, and pulled her away from the table. Her hair fell loose from its bun as she struggled, begging, but there was no weight behind her words anymore. She was no longer the Vivian Pierce who stood in front of me with threats disguised as family speeches. She was a woman dragged down by the very gravity she'd spent her life denying existed. As she disappeared through the door, the room fell quiet. I exhaled slowly, steady the way I had before breaching a door on deployment. Not joy, not triumph, just the kind of clarity that comes when the final loose end is tied. People think revenge is about fire. It isn't. It's about silence that no longer hurts. It's about breathing without her name hanging in the air. I walked out of the facility without looking back. Outside, the sky was pale blue, the kind of crisp winter light that makes everything sharp and honest. I got in my truck and sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet hum of the engine. The war she started had already ended, but this was the last shot fired, a plea denied. Vivian Pierce had spent her life believing she was too powerful to face consequences. She died a little today, not because of bars or guards, but because for the first time in her life, someone she thought she controlled looked her in the eye and said no. And that no was stronger than any legacy she ever tried to build. 3 months passed quietly, not with the rush of victory, but with the slow, steady settling of a storm finally spent. The air in Fort Liberty carried that crisp, early spring clarity, the kind that makes everything feel sharper, cleaner. Emma was back in school on base, her laughter echoing through the hallways like a melody I had once feared I'd never hear again. Her teacher said she was reading ahead of her age, that she liked standing near the fence at recess but didn't flinch anymore when a car passed by. Her small backpack hung on the hook by our front door again, the way it used to, and some mornings when I laced my boots for work, I caught her humming to herself in the kitchen. I didn't try to capture those moments. I just let them breathe. Reporters kept calling, of course. National outlets wanted a statement, local papers wanted exclusive interviews, and some organization even wanted to make Emma's case a symbol of systemic resilience. I said no to all of them. Not because I didn't believe in the cause, but because this wasn't a story for them to own. It belonged to Emma, to the quiet walls of our house, to the nights we sat side by side on the porch counting fireflies instead of counting scars. The only public event I agreed to was the annual Child Protection Memorial on base, a solemn gathering meant to remember and rebuild. I stood in uniform beneath the rows of flags listening to names being read, some of them children who didn't get second chances. My hand rested lightly on Emma's shoulder the entire time. She wore a small white dress with a blue ribbon in her hair. She held my fingers without looking up, as if she understood more than a 6-year-old should ever have to. The house that Vivian once called her empire no longer bore her name. It had been seized under forfeiture statutes tied to her criminal conviction, and after the legal dust settled, the estate's assets were transferred to the Military Children Protection Fund, a federal program that provides legal and psychological aid to kids of active service members. It was poetic not because it erased what she did, but because it turned her power into something that would protect the very children she tried to harm. People whispered about how poetic that was. I didn't participate in the whispers. I just watched the news ticker the night the transfer was announced, closed the laptop, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Life had a way of finding stillness after war. Mine came in small, unremarkable ways. No more late-night knocks from CID, no more depositions, no more courtrooms that smelled of old wood and sharpened judgments. Just the quiet rhythm of morning runs on the base trail, the steady scrape of boots on gravel, the sound of Emma's soft breathing as she slept in the next room. Sometimes quiet feels foreign after you've lived in crisis for so long, like a language you once spoke but forgot how to pronounce. But each day it became more familiar. One evening in late March, I stood in the backyard with a cup of tea in my hand, looking at the fence where I had found Emma 3 months earlier. The winter grass was slowly turning green again, the night humming with the first signs of spring insects. The security lights cast long shadows over the lawn, but they no longer felt like searchlights on a battlefield. They were just lights. The fence was just a fence. And yet I couldn't look at that spot without remembering the sound of my daughter's shallow breathing, the way her small hand had been limp against mine. Memory doesn't leave. It becomes part of the air. But now it didn't crush me. It anchored me. Ethan stopped by, sometimes mostly unannounced, always with the same quiet presence. We didn't talk about Vivian anymore. We talked about his niece's soccer games, the upcoming base security review, the way the spring storms rolled in fast over Carolina. Rebecca visited once with a thick binder of final filings from the case, everything neatly sealed and stored. "It's officially over," she said, sliding the binder across the table. I didn't open it. I just placed it on the shelf. Vivian Pierce still existed, of course. She was serving her sentence in a federal facility, stripped of the empire she had built on fear and inheritance. People said she'd aged 10 years in 3 months. I never read the articles. She didn't matter anymore. She was not the monster under our bed or the shadow at the fence line. She was just a name in a file. Emma had started sleeping through the night again. That was the quiet victory. No more waking up with a jolt whispering for me in the dark. No more flinching when headlights flashed across the curtains. She started asking questions about my deployments, about her dad, about the medals on my wall. I told her what I could, the way soldiers tell children the truth with careful edges. She wanted to learn how to tie her shoelaces like soldiers do. She asked if we could plant flowers near the fence where I had found her. So one Saturday morning, we did. We knelt together in the soil, our hands dirty and warm, the way healing sometimes hides inside the simplest gestures. People often think justice is a loud thing, that it comes with fireworks or big speeches or some satisfying crescendo where good stands over evil and declares victory. But standing in my backyard, watching my daughter run across the grass with a plastic dinosaur in her hand, I understood what it really was. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just steady. It's the quiet of a fence that no longer carries fear. It's the silence between footsteps when you're not looking over your shoulder anymore. It's the warmth of a child's hand in yours no longer trembling. The war with Vivian Pierce had ended. But its lessons stayed etched into the bones of our house, into the way I breathe when the wind rustles through the fence, into the way Emma looks at the world with both innocence and a strength she should never have had to earn. I can't erase what happened. But I can build a world where it no longer defines us. As the sun set, casting a deep orange glow over the fence line, Emma ran toward me, hair flying, cheeks flushed with the kind of joy that doesn't ask for permission. I bent down, scooped her up, and spun her once in the golden light. Her laughter filled the air like a promise I intended to keep. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about the quiet that comes after the kind that feels like breathing for the first time in too long. If it were your child, your family, your silence hanging in the balance, what would you have done? What would you have risked? What would you have fought for? Tell me in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe, like I do, that real justice isn't a headline. It's what happens when the world finally stops spinning out of control and lets you stand still again.